My name is Caleb Marsh, and the morning I found out my father owned land I never knew existed, I was standing in my workshop at the back of a rented property on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, trying to fix a table saw that had been giving me trouble for 3 weeks. It was early November, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but settles in quietly overnight, so that when you open the shop door in the morning, the air hits you in the face and reminds you that the warm months are gone and won't be back for a long time. I had a space heater running in the corner. It made noise without making much difference. I had coffee going cold on the workbench beside a set of chisels I'd been meaning to resharpen for a month, and I had my phone face down next to the coffee because I had learned over the years that the best way to get work done in the morning was to pretend the phone didn't exist until the work was done. That morning, the work was not getting done. The saw had a vibration in the blade housing that I couldn't locate. I'd taken the guard off, checked the arbor, checked the belt tension, rechecked the blade alignment twice, and the vibration was still there. Faint but present, the kind of thing that most people would ignore and that I could not ignore. Because my father had taught me that a tool that vibrates wrong is a tool that's telling you something. And if you don't listen to what it's telling you, it will eventually show you what it meant in a way that costs you more than just time. My father's name was Warren Marsh. He had been a mechanic and a metal worker, and a man who knew more about the internal logic of machines than almost anyone I had ever met. He had wide knuckles and hands that were never completely clean, and he had a way of going still when he was thinking that made the room feel quieter around him. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who explained himself often. But when he did speak about something that mattered, you listened because the words were chosen carefully, and there weren't many of them, and they didn't repeat themselves. He had died 7 months earlier, or so I had believed. He had been found in his apartment in Columbus on a Tuesday morning in April, and the death had been attributed to cardiac arrest, and there had been a funeral on a gray Saturday with a closed casket and a priest who read words that felt too formal for the kind of man Warren Marsh had been, a man who fixed things with his hands and paid his bills and showed up when he said he would show up, and never once in my life made me doubt that he loved me, even though he almost never said it directly. He showed it the way men of his generation showed it, by teaching you things, by being present, by handing you the right tool before you knew you needed it. I had stood at that funeral in the rain and felt the particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone who was the fixed point of your life. Not the loudest person in the room, not the most demonstrative, but the one whose presence meant that the world was ordered correctly and whose absence meant something had shifted in the architecture of everything. I had gone home afterward, changed out of my good clothes, and gone back to work the next morning because I was a 34-year-old man with a workshop lease and a son named Stellan who needed lunch packed and clothes washed, and a father who showed up. And because I had learned from Warren Marsh that grief was something you carried while you kept moving, not something you stopped for. 7 months later, I was still carrying it. Stellan was 6 years old and had his grandfather's eyes, that shade of gray that looks different depending on the light, sometimes almost blue, sometimes the color of riverstone in winter. He lived with me 3 days a week and with his mother the other 4. My marriage to Renata had ended 2 years before Warren died, and the ending had been quiet and civil in the way that endings are when two people have simply grown into different shapes, and neither one of them has done anything specifically wrong. We were good parents to Stellan separately in a way we had struggled to be together. That was the arrangement. It worked. On the mornings I had Stellan, I packed his lunch before I went to the workshop, and I thought about him while I worked. On the mornings I didn't have him, I thought about him anyway, and I worked longer. In the workshop was either a comfort or a weight, depending on the day. That morning it was a weight. The saw was still vibrating wrong, and my coffee was cold, and I had 3 custom cabinet orders to get through before the end of the month, and the space heater was losing its argument with November. I turned my phone over. Unknown number, Wyoming area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had a policy about unknown numbers during work hours that I had established after a particularly unpleasant stretch of dealing with a supplier dispute the previous spring. But something made me answer it. I couldn't have told you what. Some instinct I hadn't asked for. The voice on the other end was an older man, deliberate, and measured the voice of someone who chose his words the way my father chose his tools one at a time for specific purposes. His name was Silas Holt. He was an attorney based in Harrow Bend, Wyoming, and he was calling regarding the estate of Warren Marsh. I set down the wrench I was holding. I told him there must be a mistake. My father's estate had been settled months ago. There wasn't much of it. An apartment, a truck, a set of hand tools I had kept because I couldn't give them away because they still smelled like machine oil, and something I couldn't name that I associated entirely with my father's workshop and no other place on earth. Silas Holt said there was no mistake. He told me that my father had owned a piece of property in Teton County, Wyoming for 22 years. 87 acres of farmland just outside Harrow Bend. That property taxes had been paid every year without exception through an escrow account Warren had established for that specific purpose. That the property was described in a will valid and notarized in which I was named as sole beneficiary. I stood in my workshop with the cold air coming in under the door and the space heater running its losing argument in the corner, and I tried to build a version of my father that included 87 acres of land in Wyoming that he had owned for 22 years and paid taxes on and never once mentioned to me. A man who had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus for the last 15 years of his life and driven a 12-year-old truck and repaired engines in a rented garage, and who had apparently simultaneously been paying property taxes on land in Wyoming for over 2 decades. The pieces didn't fit together into anything I recognized. I asked Holt if he could tell me anything more about the property. He said it was farmland, mostly open acreage with some timber, a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. He said it had been largely unoccupied for years. He said Warren had been very specific in his instructions regarding the property, and that those instructions were contained in the will and would be read to me in person when I came to Harrow Bend. I asked when I needed to come. He said soon. He said the matter was, in his words, time sensitive. I put down the phone and stood in my workshop for a long time without moving. The saw sat on its stand in the middle of the room with the guard still off and the vibration problem still unsolved. The cold air sat in the corners. The space heater made its noise. I called Bernard Caulfield. Bernard had come into my life 4 years earlier, not long after Stellan turned 2. He had shown up at the funeral of a man named Devlin who had served with Warren in the Army, a gathering of older men at a VFW hall in Westerville, and he had introduced himself as someone who had known my father briefly during their service years. He was a big man with a deliberate way of moving and a voice that carried without effort, and he had the steadiness of someone who had seen difficult things and come through them without being made smaller by the experience. Over the years that followed, Bernard had become a presence in my life in the way that certain people become presences without you being entirely sure when it happened. He checked in regularly. He had helped me move my workshop equipment when I changed locations the previous spring. He called every Sunday evening, which was one of the nights I didn't have Stellan, and we talked about the week and about work, and sometimes about my father, and those conversations had been, in the months after Warren's death, among the things that made the caring easier. He had been there when I sorted through Warren's apartment. He had sat with me for 3 hours going through boxes of old paperwork and personal effects, and he had been patient and quiet, in the right way present, without being intrusive, which is a skill that not many people have. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has been consistently there. When I told him about the call from Silas Holt, he was quiet for a moment in the way he sometimes was when he was thinking something through. Then he said he would come with me. I hadn't asked him to. He offered before I had the chance to formulate the thought. He said he knew Wyoming a little, that he had driven through that part of the state years ago, and that no one should have to navigate something like this alone. I said it was a long drive. He said he didn't mind driving. We left Columbus at 5 in the morning on a Friday. Bernard's truck loaded with 2 bags and a cooler. Stellan was with Renata for the week. The highway was dark and empty in both directions, and the city gave way to the flat farmland of central Ohio almost immediately, and then to Indiana, and then to the wide-open sky of the plains. Bernard drove most of the way. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the country change and let my mind go to the place it had been going for the past 7 months, back to my father. to all the things I had never asked. Not because I hadn't wanted to know, but because there was a quality to Warren Marsh's silence that made certain questions feel like intrusions. He had a way of becoming very still when conversation moved toward territory he didn't want to enter, and you could feel the boundary without him ever stating it directly, and I had learned over my lifetime to read those silences and respect them. He had earned them somehow, though I had never known how. Now I was driving to Wyoming to see 87 acres of land my father had owned for 22 years, without telling me it existed, and the silences he had never explained had a new weight to them. Somewhere in the long, flat stretch of Nebraska, Bernard said something that lodged itself in my thinking without my fully understanding why. He asked if my father had ever mentioned the name of the town, Harrow Bend specifically. I turned to look at him. The question itself was simple enough. We were driving to Harrow Bend. It was reasonable to wonder whether I had heard the name before, but the specificity of it was unusual. He hadn't asked whether my father had ever mentioned Wyoming, or whether he had ever talked about having property somewhere. He had asked about the name of the town, the specific name, as though the name itself was the thing he was curious about rather than the broader question of whether I'd known about the land at all. I said no, my father had never mentioned it. Bernard nodded slowly and reached for his coffee, and that was the end of it. The conversation moved on. The road moved on. The plains opened up into Wyoming, and the light went golden in the afternoon, and the mountains appeared on the horizon like something that had been there since before people had words for things. But the question stayed with me. I filed it somewhere in the back of my thinking and left it there. We arrived in Harrow Bend as the sun was going down. It was a small town in the way that certain small western towns are small, not impoverished exactly, but stripped down to its essentials in a way that felt deliberate rather than neglected. One main street, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station with two pumps, one of which had an out-of-order sign that looked like it had been there for several years. The mountains behind it were going purple in the last light. Silas Holt's office was on the second floor of the hardware store, accessible by an exterior staircase. It was a room that seemed to have been arranged for the specific purpose of communicating reliability rather than comfort. Wood-paneled walls, stacked files on every surface, a desk that had been used for serious work for a very long time. Holt himself was a slight man in his late 70s with reading glasses that he pushed up onto his forehead when he wasn't using them, and the patience of someone who had spent decades practicing law in a place where people came to him with complicated problems and expected him to be steady about them. He shook my hand. He shook Bernard's hand. He gestured to two chairs and sat down behind his desk and opened a folder with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understood that what was in the folder mattered and deserved to be approached with appropriate care. He placed before me a deed of title. My father's name was on it. The property described in careful legal language was 87 acres in Harrow Bend Township, Teton County, Wyoming, with structures including a main residence, a barn, and 3 outbuildings. Warren had owned it since 2002, which was 22 years ago, which was when I was 12 years old, and we were living in the same 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus that Warren would live in for the rest of his life. I looked at the deed for a long time. Beside it, Holt placed a ring of keys, 3 of them. 2 looked like standard house keys worn with age. The third was different, heavier, older in construction, with a thick cylindrical shaft and a bit at the end that was more complex than any modern key I had seen. The kind of key that had been made to open something substantial, something meant to stay locked. Then Holt unfolded the will. He read it in the precise, measured voice of a man who understood the weight of what he was reading and was not going to rush it. Most of the document was standard language. The portion that was not standard, the portion he paused slightly before reading, was short. My father had written that the property known as the Harrow Bend Farmstead was to be transferred in full to his son Caleb Warren Marsh, that I was to understand the following: that the land must never be sold, not for any price, not under any pressure, not under any circumstances, never. The room was quiet when Holt finished reading. Bernard leaned forward slightly in his chair. He said it was an unusual instruction. Holt agreed that it was unusual, but said it had been Warren's explicit direction, stated with considerable emphasis during the drafting of the document, and that he had no reason to believe it was anything other than an entirely deliberate and considered instruction. I held the key ring in my hand. The old key was heavier than it looked. I curled my fingers around it and felt its weight settle in my palm. There was something about the way it sat there that felt like a statement rather than an object, like it had been made to be found in exactly this moment by exactly this person. We drove out to the property as the last color left the sky. The driveway was a long gravel road cutting through tall autumn grass with pine trees on both sides that had gone dark in the early evening. At the end of it, the farmhouse appeared. 2 stories, white paint peeling back to bare wood, a porch that sagged at one corner and had been doing so for some time. A barn further back, its boards weathered to a silver gray that you see on old wood that has been through many Wyoming winters without complaint. But it was the land that stopped me when I got out of the truck. It went in every direction, rolling gently toward the mountains, 87 acres of dried autumn grass, in silence and cold air coming down from the peaks, with the smell of snow somewhere at the back of its throat. I stood in the gravel and looked at it and felt something I didn't have the right word for. Not peace, more like the sensation of standing at the edge of something very large that you hadn't known was there. A sudden awareness of scale that changes how small you understand yourself to be. Bernard stood beside me. He said it was a lot of land. I said yes. He asked what I thought I might do with it. I looked at him. He was looking out at the fields, his face neutral in the dim light. Neutral in the way that a face can be neutral when the person is making an effort to appear unconcerned. A man standing beside land that his friend's son had just inherited, asking what might be done with it, with a face that was working very hard to seem casual about the question. I said I had no idea. We went inside. The house smelled like cedar and old paper, and something faintly metallic, the smell of air that has been still for a long time in a space built to last. I moved through the room slowly while Bernard settled onto the couch in the front room and turned on an old television set that apparently still received signal. The furniture was sparse: a table, chairs, a bookcase with paperback novels, everything arranged with functional care as though someone had thought about what a person would need in each room and provided exactly that and nothing more. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms, both empty, both clean in the way of rooms that have been left in a state of deliberate readiness rather than abandonment, as though someone had considered how they would be found and had wanted them found in exactly this condition. The 2nd bedroom was at the back of the house, smaller than the first. A single window looking out over the back of the property toward the barn, and beyond the barn, open field stretching away into the dark. The moonlight came through the window and fell in a clean white rectangle across the wooden floorboards. That's where I stopped. One of the floorboards was raised, not cracked, not warped from moisture, raised with intention. Along both edges, the wood was scratched in the way that wood gets scratched when something is lifted and replaced repeatedly over time. Small, careful scratches, the kind that accumulate over years of a specific repeated action performed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. My hands were moving before I had consciously decided to move them. I knelt on the floor and worked my fingers into the gap at the edge of the board. It came up cleanly the way something comes up when the nails have been removed long ago and only the weight of the wood is holding it in place. Below the board was a metal box wrapped in canvas cloth that had once been green and had faded to something between gray and brown. The box was not large, perhaps the size of a hardcover book. It had a simple latch and no lock. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. Then I lifted it out. It was lighter than I expected, but it felt significant in the way that small containers of important things always feel significant, a density of meaning that has nothing to do with mass. I opened it. Inside the large iron key from the ring Silas Holt had given me a duplicate. I understood immediately the twin of the one I had brought from the attorney's office. A hand-drawn map on folded paper showing the farmstead and the surrounding land in careful pencil, with a location circled in red ink behind the barn. Beside the red circle in my father's handwriting, precise and unhurried, the way his handwriting always was old well. And beneath those folded once a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it. 4 words in Warren Marsh's hand. No date, no explanation, no preamble of any kind. Trust no one, not even Bernard. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time. Downstairs, I could hear Bernard shifting on the couch, the low murmur of the television, the sound of the old house settling around him in the November cold. I read the note again. Then I folded it back along the same crease, replaced it in the box, put the map and the duplicate key in the inner pocket of my jacket, and placed the box back in the hollow beneath the board and settled the board back into its place. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and tried to understand what my father had done and why. Warren Marsh had owned this land for 22 years. He had paid taxes on it every year through a dedicated escrow account, a deliberately and carefully maintained arrangement that required ongoing attention. He had written it into his will with an instruction so specific and so emphatic that even a lawyer who had seen many unusual instructions had paused before reading it aloud. He had hidden a box beneath the floorboards of a room that no one would have reason to examine unless they were alone in the house at night and moving through it with the kind of attention that comes from being told nothing and needing to understand something. He had left a map and a key for a location behind the barn, and he had left a note warning me against the one person who had come with me to this place, the one person I had trusted enough to call when the lawyer's number came in from Wyoming. The person who was downstairs right now watching television in the front room of a house my father had owned for 22 years and kept entirely secret. Bernard Caulfield, who had come into my life 4 years ago through a connection to my father that I had never questioned. Who had been present at every difficult moment in the years since. Who asked in the long, flat middle of Nebraska about the specific name of the town. The name of the town. I sat with that in the dark for a long time. I was a 34-year-old carpenter from Columbus, Ohio. I had my father's hands, or I had been trying to develop them over years of working with wood and metal and the logic of how things fit together. I had not inherited whatever Warren had been carrying in the silences he never explained because he had not given me the chance to. He had kept it somewhere else. He had kept it here in Wyoming in 87 acres of land and a box beneath a floorboard and a note that told me to trust no one. I made a decision in that room. I would not tell Bernard about the note. I would not tell him about the box or the map or the duplicate key. I would go back downstairs and be the version of myself that Bernard expected to see, a tired man who had just received a great deal of information and needed sleep. I would be calm and I would be unremarkable, and in the morning I would find a reason to go behind the barn alone. I went back downstairs. Bernard looked up from the couch when I came in. He asked how the upstairs looked. I said empty. Clean. Like nobody had been up there in years. He nodded. He said the place had good bones. He said Warren had always known how to pick things that would last. I said yes, that was true, and sat down in the chair across from him and watched the television for a while without seeing it, and eventually said I was tired from the drive and was going to turn in. Bernard said good idea and that we would figure out next steps in the morning. I went back upstairs and lay on the floor of the first bedroom because there was no mattress, with my jacket folded under my head and the iron key in my jacket pocket, and I listened to the house settle around me and the wind move through the pine trees outside and the sound of Wyoming at night, which is a specific and enormous silence that a city person can mistake for emptiness, but which is actually the sound of a place that has been here for a very long time and does not need anything from you. I did not sleep for several hours. When I finally did, I slept lightly the way you sleep when part of you is keeping watch. I woke before 5. The sky outside was the particular pre-dawn gray that exists for only a short time. Not quite dark, not yet light, the world holding its breath between the two states. I laced my boots in the dark and pulled on my jacket and felt the weight of the iron key in the pocket and moved through the house as quietly as I knew how to move, which was quietly enough. I had spent years working in spaces where other people were sleeping. I had learned the skill of moving without sound. Bernard's door was closed. I paused outside it for a moment and heard nothing from within. I went down the stairs and through the kitchen and out the back door. The cold hit me immediately. The full weight of a Wyoming November morning, clean and sharp, and carrying the bite of altitude that Columbus never had. My breath came out in clouds. The grass was stiff with frost. The barn was a dark shape about 300 yards to the west, and the land beyond it was lost in the pre-dawn gray. I moved toward it through the frozen grass. The frost crunched slightly under my boots, and there was nothing I could do about that, but the sound was small, and the distance was large, and the wind was moving in the pine trees along the property line and covering most of what I made. I went around the west side of the barn and continued into the field behind it, following the line of an old fence. The map had shown the well somewhere in this area. I moved slowly, scanning the ground ahead of me, and then I saw it. A stone ring rising from the field perhaps 50 yards past the barn, half buried in overgrowth. Vines had claimed the lower stones. Old boards had been laid across the top, warped by weather beginning to rot at the edges. It looked like what it was, an old well disused for years, unremarkable, unless you were looking for it. I stood at the edge of it and looked down through the gaps between the boards. No water. The inside walls were dry stone and bolted into the stone on the south side, beginning about 3 feet below the rim, were iron rungs. A ladder. Old rust darkened, but the installation was solid. The kind of work done by someone who understood metalwork and who had made something intended to hold weight under repeated use. The bolts were set deep. The rungs were spaced deliberately. This had not been put here by accident or as a temporary measure. Someone had built this to last. A well does not need a ladder. I stood there for a moment and felt the cold air moving around me, and the weight of the key in my pocket, and the weight of the note I had read the night before. Trust no one, not even Bernard. And then the weight of 87 acres of silence around me, and the mountains in the distance going from dark to slightly less dark as the sky began its slow change. My father had been a man who built things to last. He had been a man who prepared for contingencies before they arrived. He had owned this land for 22 years and paid the taxes faithfully and hidden a box in the floor and left a map to the spot and a key to something at the bottom of it. He had wanted me to come down here. I moved the boards aside carefully, setting them in the frost-stiff grass one at a time. The opening below was dark and cold and smelled of stone and earth, and something else underneath, something that took me a moment to identify. Concrete. The smell of sealed concrete in an enclosed space, a smell I associated with foundations and basements and the hidden structural bones of old buildings. I took the small flashlight from my jacket pocket and turned it on. The ladder descended into darkness. The rungs were cold through my work gloves, but they were solid each one as I tested them before committing weight. I went down slowly. 10 feet, 15, 20. The morning light above me shrank to a circle, and then to something smaller than a circle, and then the air changed, completely cooler and stiller than the air above, carrying that sealed concrete smell more strongly now. My boots hit solid ground, not dirt, concrete. I swept the flashlight beam around me. I was standing at the base of a narrow tunnel extending horizontally in one direction away from the well shaft. Wooden support beams ran along both walls at regular intervals, set with the care of someone who understood structural load. Old electrical wire ran along the ceiling from a junction box near the base of the ladder. The rubber coating yellowed with age but intact. The floor was level and clean. The walls were close, perhaps 4 feet apart, but the construction was deliberate and solid and had clearly been here for a long time. Someone had built this. Not recently. This had taken months. It had taken planning and materials and the specific knowledge of how to make something underground that would hold. It had taken secrecy and patience and the particular determination of a person who builds alone in the dark toward a purpose no one else knows about. I stood still and listened. At first, there was nothing beyond my own breathing, and the faint sound of the wind far above diminished to almost nothing by the depth in the stone. Then I heard it. faint, uneven, the sound of air moving through a constricted passage in a rhythm that was too slow and too regular for an animal too quiet for anything mechanical. Breathing. Human breathing, weak and slightly ragged, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. I stood there for a moment and did what any person would do when they hear an unexpected sound in an underground tunnel. I thought about leaving, about going back up the ladder and back to the house and calling someone a sheriff. Someone whose job it was to go toward unknown sounds in dark tunnels rather than away from them. I thought about that for exactly as long as it took me to recognize what I was hearing. I had grown up in a workshop. I had spent years working with my hands in a space where my father worked alongside me. I had learned to read materials and tools and the sounds they made when something was right and when something was wrong. And I had learned it from a man whose breathing I had known my entire life. A sound particular in its rhythm, in the slight catch at the top of the inhale, that had been there since he took a blow to the ribs in a work accident when I was 16 and had never fully resolved. A sound as familiar to me as the sound of his voice. I moved forward. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and just high enough to walk upright without ducking if you were my height. I went slowly, the flashlight ahead of me, the boots quiet on the concrete floor. The breathing grew marginally louder with each step, and then the tunnel ended at a door. A steel door set directly into the concrete of the tunnel wall. Heavy. The hinges were dark with rust at the surface, but the installation itself was solid. The door hung true in its frame with no sag. The lock was a keyhole lock of the old style, the kind that took a key with a long, thick shaft and a complex bit at the end. The kind of key I was carrying in my jacket pocket. My hands were not steady when I took it out. I was 34 years old and I had been building things with my hands since I was old enough to hold a hammer, and I had my father's hands, or I was trying to, and my hands were not steady. I fitted the key into the lock. It turned. The sound it made was loud in the silence of the tunnel. A solid, heavy click. The sound of something that had been locked for a very long time, releasing all at once without ambiguity, without hesitation, cleanly and completely. I pushed the door open. The room on the other side was small. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a ceiling low enough that a tall man would have to watch himself. A bare bulb wired into the old electrical system that ran through the tunnel. A wooden table. A bookshelf against the far wall lined with paperback novels and 2 legal-size binders and 3 small external hard drives in a wooden rack. A camp stove on a shelf beside several cans of food. A narrow cot against the far wall. On the cot, a man. He was thin in the way that a person becomes thin when they have lost weight slowly over a long period of time. Not dramatic thinness, but the thinness of sustained deprivation. The kind that changes the shape of a face gradually until the bones are more present than they used to be. His hair had gone entirely white. He was wearing a flannel shirt that was a size too large for him now, and work pants gone pale at the knees from long use. One hand was raised to shield his eyes from the beam of the flashlight. I knew that hand. I had known that hand for 34 years. The width of the knuckles, the way the tendons ran across the back of it, the scar at the base of the right thumb from a drive belt incident when I was 11 years old that he had dismissed at the time as nothing worth making a fuss over, and that had left a permanent white line in the skin. And above the left eyebrow, a small raised scar in the shape of a crescent moon from a fall off a ladder the summer I was 9, when he had been clearing a block gutter on the house, and I had watched from the yard below and been frightened in a way I had never forgotten. The flashlight shook in my grip. The man on the cot slowly lowered his hand from his eyes. He blinked twice against the light. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes were gray, the same gray I had looked at across every kitchen table of my childhood. I had not understood until this moment, standing in a concrete room 20 feet underground, how much I had missed them. "Dad," I said. The word came out barely above a whisper. My throat had done something involuntary around it. The word was there, and then it wasn't absorbed by the concrete walls and the silence and the weight of 7 months of carrying a grief that I understood in this moment had been built on something that was not true. The man on the cot lowered his hand completely. He blinked again. Then he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on Warren Marsh's face in all the years of my life knowing him. He was afraid. Not of me. I understood that immediately with the certainty of a person who has known someone long enough to read the full vocabulary of their face. He was afraid for me. "Dad," I said again. This time my voice broke on it. He rose from the cot, slowly using the table for balance with the careful movements of someone who had been still for a long time and whose body remembered movement without fully trusting it anymore. He straightened to his full height, still taller than me, and he looked at me with those gray eyes across the small concrete room. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said very quietly the words that shifted everything. "The man they buried wasn't me." I stood in the doorway of that underground room with the flashlight in my hand and looked at my father, the man whose closed casket I had stood beside 7 months ago, in the April rain, whose death I had spent 7 months learning to carry, whose absence I had reorganized my entire understanding of the world around, and I tried to find the place in my thinking where this fit. There was no such place. "How?" I said. The word came out flat, stripped of inflection, not quite a question, and not quite anything else. Just the only sound I could make that was close to what I meant. "Sit down," Warren said. His voice was rougher than I remembered it, scraped thin at the edges by years of disuse, but the cadence was his, the particular rhythm of it, the way he weighted certain words and let others pass quickly unchanged by whatever had happened to the rest of him. "Sit down and listen. There are things I need to tell you, and we don't have much time." I stepped into the room. The steel door swung nearly closed behind me. I sat on the edge of the cot, and my father stood by the wooden table and looked at me. And for a moment before he began to speak, he simply looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been a great distance from for a very long time, taking inventory, checking against memory, making sure the reality matches what he has been carrying in his mind through the long underground years. Then he said, "First, before anything else, did you come alone?" The question was careful. The weight behind it was not. He was not asking whether I had driven by myself. He was asking something specific, and the specificity was in the way his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly when he said it, and in the direction his eyes had moved briefly toward the tunnel behind me. I thought about Bernard's truck in the driveway, Bernard on the couch with the television, Bernard asking somewhere in the long, flat emptiness of Nebraska about the specific name of the town. "No," I said. "I didn't come alone." Something went very still in Warren Marsh's eyes. Not surprise. Something older than surprise, something that had the texture of a fear carried for a long time and just confirmed rather than introduced. "Who?" he said. I watched his face carefully. "Bernard Caulfield," I said. What happened to my father's expression in the seconds after I said that name was not something I had words for in the moment and am not sure I have adequate words for now. It was not a single thing. It was a sequence of things, recognition, confirmation, a dread that had been waiting for this particular shape to arrive. And underneath all of it, something that looked like the resolution of a man who had spent years preparing for a moment and understood that the moment had now come. "Then we have less time than I thought," he said quietly. "Sit down, Caleb, and listen to everything I tell you." He told me about Harlan Druce. Druce was a real estate developer out of Denver, late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who had spent 40 years acquiring things before other people understood what they were acquiring. He operated through a network of shell companies with names that communicated nothing. Clearwater Holdings, Summit Acquisition, Group Ridgeline Property, partners' names designed to be forgettable, to look like individual transactions rather than components of a larger design. For 14 years, he had been buying land in Teton County, parcel by parcel, quarter section by quarter section, working methodically outward from a center point. That center point was underneath us. My father crossed to the bookshelf and pulled one of the binders, opened it, and laid a hand-drawn map on the table between us. It showed the farmstead, the 87 acres, and the surrounding land for several miles in every direction. The parcels Druce had acquired were shaded in pencil, and when I looked at the full picture, the pattern was immediate and unmistakable. Every piece of land Druce had bought formed a ring around my father's property. A perfect, deliberate encirclement executed over 14 years through transactions that would have looked unrelated unless you had the patience in the specific knowledge to connect them. The reason was below us, Lithium Warren said, and rare earth elements, a significant deposit that certain geologists had been quietly aware of for years. The deposit ran beneath a large area, but the surface access was complicated by federal land restrictions on three sides. The fourth side came up directly under this farm. This property was the only viable point of entry that was not federal land and therefore not off limits for commercial development. Without this parcel, Druce could not reach the deposit. The 14 years of surrounding acquisitions, the millions spent, the careful, patient encirclement were worth nothing without the one piece at the center. He had first approached my father 22 years ago, not long after Warren bought the land. Politely at first, then persistently, then in the way that certain powerful men approach resistance when they are not accustomed to encountering it by making the cost of refusal visible. Warren described it without particular drama in the flat factual way he described most things. A vehicle parked at the end of the driveway 3 days running, a break-in that took nothing, then the barn. He stopped for a moment. I lost 4 animals in that fire, he said. His hands were folded on the table and they were very still. I had the stock then, horses, a few head of cattle. The fire moved fast and I got the horses from the near stalls, but the others. He stopped again. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what a barn fire meant. I had grown up around enough people who worked with animals to understand what it meant when animals died because of a fire that should not have happened. Did you go to the police? I said. I did, Warren said. His eyes met mine. Deputy sheriff at the time was a man named Aldous Pruitt. He filed a report. He concluded the fire was accidental. He had been receiving payments from one of Druce's holding companies for 6 years. I didn't know that at the time. I sat with that for a moment. Then he told me about Rancher Tilson. Tilson had run cattle on land 2 counties east, a third-generation operation that had been in his family since the 1940s. He had refused to sell grazing land that turned out to sit above a natural gas deposit, refused through 3 years of offers and pressure, and the kind of sustained attention that a wealthy and motivated man can bring to bear on someone who simply wants to be left alone. 3 months after Tilson declined what Druce's intermediaries called a final offer, there was a fire. Tilson and his wife had been in town for the evening. They came home to a structure that could not be saved. Druce was never connected to it. There were no charges. There was no investigation of sufficient depth to find what was underneath, because the people whose job it was to investigate had reasons not to look too hard. Tilson rebuilt with the insurance money and sold the land 2 years later. The gas deposit was developed within 18 months of the sale. I looked at my father across the table in that underground room and understood for the first time that we were not talking about a man who was simply greedy and willing to apply pressure to get what he wanted. We were talking about a man who had looked at another man's livelihood and home and decided that these things were not obstacles so much as variables to be adjusted. A man who had done the arithmetic and concluded that the right application of destruction delivered at the right time and insulated by sufficient distance could solve problems that money alone could not. I understand why you didn't sell, I said. Warren looked at me. He said nothing, but something in his face confirmed that I had understood correctly. It was never only about the money. It was never only about the principle of not being forced. It was about knowing what Druce was and what he did to people who stood in his way, and the decision that Warren Marsh had made sometime in the years after the barn burned and the sheriff filed his useless report, the decision that if Druce wanted this land, he was going to have to come through something that would cost him far more than the land was worth. That was when the recordings began. 10 years ago, Warren had started placing small, voice-activated recording devices around the property, in the fence posts along the property line, in the rebuilt barn, along the porch eaves, in the frame of the driveway gate. Devices small enough to pass for hardware set to activate on sound and record to small cards that Warren retrieved and cataloged with the patient care of someone doing long-term work with a long-term purpose. Druce had a specific aversion to electronic communication for anything he considered sensitive. He had operated in real estate long enough to have watched other people's phone records and emails become evidence in proceedings they had not anticipated, and he had developed a practice of conducting his most consequential conversations in person on site in places he believed were private. He came to the Harrow Bend property regularly, walking the fence line, meeting with various individuals, discussing things that he was confident no one was listening to. He was wrong about that for 10 years. 3 hard drives on the shelf behind me, thousands of hours of recordings, printed transcripts in the 2 binders, county commissioners, state officials, the names of intermediaries, specific figures, specific accounts, the architecture of corruption rendered in Druce's own voice, speaking freely in a place he had decided was safe. 3 days ago, Warren had sent copies of everything to the FBI field office in Cheyenne through an arrangement he had made with a woman named Ingrid Vane, the current Teton County sheriff, who had been quietly coordinating the case for 2 years and who had been waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who understood that the case had to be complete before it was moved on. The originals were here in this room on the shelf behind me. I sat with all of that for a moment. Then I said Bernard's name again and asked my father to tell me exactly. Warren looked at me. Bernard Caulfield, he said carefully, is not someone I have ever met. He is not someone I served with. He does not have any history with me. That is what he has told you it was. He was placed in your life 4 years ago by Harlan Druce. The words settled into me the way very cold water settles slowly and completely, touching everything. 4 years ago, Warren said you were 29 and you were asking questions. After Renata and you separated, you called me more often. You asked about family history, about where we came from, about why we had no extended relatives. You were building something your own life, and you were trying to understand what you were building it out of. Druce had people watching this property and watching me, and they reported back that my son was asking questions and might eventually ask the right ones. He paused. Druce's calculation was that if he could place someone close to you, someone you trusted, he would know in advance if you ever discovered the land or if I ever made contact. He would know what you knew and what you didn't know, and he could manage the situation from the inside. Bernard was that person. 4 years of Sunday phone calls. 4 years of checking in on Stellan. Sitting with me while I sorted through my father's apartment after the funeral, patiently present, asking quiet questions, every answer going somewhere I had not imagined. The man who had helped me move my workshop equipment. I looked at the wall of the underground room and said nothing for a moment. He drove me here, I said. My voice was very even. I was paying attention to keeping it even. He's in the house right now. I know, Warren said. He knows I came out this morning, I said. He saw me leave. Yes, and by now he's understood that you didn't just walk around the property to clear your head. At that moment, from somewhere above us, the sound reached us even through 20 feet of earth and stone and concrete. The specific sound of tires moving slowly over gravel. A vehicle coming up the driveway. Not Bernard's truck, a different engine. Heavier. My father's gaze moved to the ceiling of the room. He was listening the way he had always listened to mechanical sounds, with his head slightly tilted and his breathing still and every faculty directed at what his ears were finding in the layers of sound. They're here, he said. He moved to the wooden table and opened the lower drawer and took out a small black receiver about the size of a thick paperback with a single speaker grill and a dial on the side. He turned it on, static, then a clean audio feed and voices. Bernard's voice first. He's not in the house. 3 words flat and entirely without the warmth I had spent 4 years hearing in that voice, and I barely recognized it the way you don't recognize a person when you see them from behind in a place you didn't expect them to be. The warmth was gone, the way a performance stops when the audience leaves completely and without residue. Then another voice, older, controlled. The voice of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any conversation and to having that fact acknowledged. Check the property, the voice said. One of the motion sensors behind the barn triggered at 6:14. Whoever came down with Caulfield went out early. I looked at my father. He was watching the receiver. Motion sensors, I said. On your land. Along the fence line, he said. Druce installed them 4 years ago. I found 3 of them within the first month. I left them in place. They told me when he was paying attention. His voice was entirely without satisfaction when he said it. It was simply a fact, one component in a long arrangement of facts that he had been managing for years. How long before they find the well, I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. The well is overgrown. If they move quickly, perhaps 20 minutes. If they're thorough, he paused less. I stood up from the cot. The room was small, 8 feet by 10 perhaps. The table, the shelf, the camp stove, the cot. One bare bulb, no window. One door, the one I had come through. Is there another way out, I asked. My father looked at me. In his expression was something I had not expected in that moment. Something that seemed out of place in an underground room with a man who had been living in it for 7 years, while a powerful man with a history of burning things looked for him. It was something close to pride. Not the surprise of a father caught off guard by his son. The pride of a man who had been waiting for his son to ask a particular question and recognized it when it arrived. Yes, he said, but first you need to hear the rest. I sat back down. He stood by the table and told me about the body. The man in the coffin had been named Clarence Aldridge, 63 years old, found deceased in a boarding house in Casper, Wyoming, 11 weeks before Warren staged his death. Aldridge had lived alone week to week, no next of kin, located no identifying documents on his person, no missing persons report ever filed. He had died of cardiac arrest in a rented room. Similar build to Warren, similar age. In the condition he was in at the time of discovery, identification would not be challenged if the death certificate was correctly filed and the body correctly transferred. Ingrid Vane had arranged all of it. She had taken a substantial risk. She had done it because she had seen what Druce had done to Tilson and understood the pattern of what Druce did to people who stood between him and something he wanted, and she believed that Warren going underground was the only way to give the case enough time to be built properly, to let Druce keep coming to the property, to keep him speaking freely in a place he thought was abandoned, to accumulate enough evidence that when it went to the FBI, it would be complete, unchallengeable, and devastating. The case file that went to Cheyenne 3 days ago contained everything: bribery, wire fraud, conspiracy, 3 counts related to the intentional harassment and intimidation of a landowner, the names of 2 county commissioners who had received payments to influence permit decisions, a state lands board official, the specific financial architecture of how money had moved from Druce's holding companies to people whose decisions he had purchased. 10 years of recordings, Warren said. He looked at the shelf behind me, all of it in Druce's own voice, because he believed this place was empty, because he believed I was dead. He paused. He's been wrong about that for 10 years. I turned and looked at the 3 hard drives in their wooden rack. Beside them, the 2 binders of printed transcripts. These were the originals. The copies were in Cheyenne. But original evidence has a weight in court that copies do not a chain of custody that cannot be reconstructed after the fact, and Druce would have lawyers the kind that charged more per hour than I made in a week, who would look for every gap in the chain. The originals mattered. Why did you need me, I asked. I was not looking at him when I said it. I was looking at the shelf. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man deciding how much to say and how to say it. Druce has had Caulfield watching you for 4 years, he said. He has a contact in the county assessor's office who flags any legal activity on this property. If I had tried to move the evidence or make contact directly without a legitimate documented reason for something to be happening here, Druce would have known immediately and he would have moved before we were ready. He needed to believe that his own asset was managing the situation. He needed to believe that you were an ordinary inheritor who had come to see a property you had never heard of with a trusted companion keeping him informed. He paused, and I needed someone I could trust completely to walk through that door. Because whoever walked through that door would have to make decisions in the dark without preparation, with incomplete information under pressure. I could not explain everything in advance. I could not warn you without the warning getting back to Druce through Caulfield. I needed someone who would find the note and understand it and act on it correctly without being told how. He looked at me. There is only one person I would trust with, that he said. The room was very quiet. From somewhere above us, through the earth, in the stone, in the concrete, the voices on the receiver had changed. They were moving. Bernard's voice outside, now closer to the barn. Another voice answering him, one I hadn't heard yet. My father reached into his jacket, which was hanging on a hook behind the door, and removed a small rectangular device about the size of a deck of cards. He clipped it to his shirt pocket. Voice activated, he said. Everything that happens above ground goes directly to an encrypted account that Ingrid Vane has access to. Whatever Druce says, whatever Caulfield says, it records and uploads simultaneously. He looked at me. Druce does not know the account exists. He moved to the corner of the room behind the cot. Along the base of the far wall was a seam I had not noticed in the initial moments of the room. Not a crack, but a deliberate gap. A precise line in the concrete made by someone who knew what they were doing. Behind what appeared to be solid wall, a low passage extended into darkness, perhaps 2.5 feet high. West Warren said, 60 feet. Comes up inside the equipment shed on the north edge of the property. 4 years to build. I worked at night, dug the far end from inside the shed, working inward. Poured the concrete in sections over 3 winters. He looked at the opening. It is not comfortable. I thought about my father alone in this room and these tunnels over the span of years, digging an escape route in the dark by increments, with the patience of someone who understood that the thing he was building might never be needed, but who built it anyway, because preparation is its own form of hope. The same patience he had brought to everything, the same hands-on, methodical attention to how things fit together in what they were built to hold. Under the cot was a canvas backpack, faded green, worn at the straps. He pulled it out and opened it and showed me the interior. A first aid kit, 2 water bottles, a folded emergency blanket, a prepaid phone sealed in a zip bag. He had packed this. He had packed it and placed it under the cot and waited for the day someone he trusted would come down that ladder. I moved to the shelf. I loaded the 3 hard drives into the pack first, then the binders, redistributing the weight until it sat evenly across my back. Heavy but manageable. Warren watched me do all of this without speaking. There was something in the way he watched that I could not have named precisely, the watching of a man who has been alone with his thoughts about a specific person for a very long time and is now observing that person in motion and finding that the reality matches what he believed. I tightened the straps. The receiver crackled. Bernard's voice cleaner, now closer to one of the external devices. Nothing in the barn, Bernard said. If he went further back, there's the old well. Does he know about it? A different voice. The controlled voice I had heard earlier. I don't see how he would, Bernard said. But there was uncertainty in it, a thinning at the edges of the confidence. Find it, Druce said. Warren clicked the receiver off and looked at me. 12 minutes, he said. Maybe less. Are you ready? Tell me about the other exit first, I said. He almost smiled. In another room, in another life, it would have been the sideways thing I remembered from childhood, the expression that meant I had said something that surprised him in a way he approved of. Here it was briefer and more guarded, but it was the same movement of the same face. I showed you, he said. He gestured toward the low passage. I know about the passage, I said. I mean from the shed. Once we're out of the shed, what's between us and cover? He told me. Open ground 120 yards north to the tree line. Dense pines, sufficient cover. A fire road a 1/4 mile beyond the trees connected to the county highway. Ingrid Vane's number was in the prepaid phone, already saved under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look. He had thought through all of it, every component. This was not improvisation. This was the execution of a plan developed over years and refined in the long hours of underground solitude, revised each time new information arrived. Each time the situation above developed in a direction he had not anticipated. I looked at my father standing in an underground room he had lived in for 7 years, and I thought about what that had required of him. Not just the physical endurance, though, that was considerable. The endurance of a man who had chosen to disappear from his son's life, who had known that every day underground was a day I was carrying something I should not have had to carry, and who had done it anyway because he had calculated that it was the only way to build something that would hold. I was angry about that. The anger was present and real, and I set it aside not because it didn't deserve acknowledgement, but because the timeline didn't permit it. There would be time for that later in a room above ground with adequate light when the immediate thing was finished. There is one more thing, Warren said. I looked at him. The recordings, the originals in that pack. If Druce finds this room before we're clear of the property, and before the FBI moves officially, and if he finds that the originals are gone, he'll know they're in play. His lawyers will know they're in play. But if something were to happen to those drives before we reach safety, the copies in Cheyenne become the sole evidentiary record. Copies can be challenged in ways that originals cannot. Chain of custody arguments, authentication disputes. With enough money and enough legal resources, it is possible to introduce sufficient doubt that the case becomes complicated. He paused. The originals have to reach Ingrid Vane. I understand, I said. He nodded once. He put on his canvas jacket from the hook behind the door. He checked the small recorder clipped to his shirt. He moved around the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who has rehearsed departure many times, touching surfaces in the way of a person saying goodbye to a space they have occupied long enough to know every inch of it. He paused at the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned away. Ready, he said. I crouched at the entrance to the low passage. The darkness inside it was total beyond the first few feet. Cold air moved through it from somewhere ahead, the slight pressure differential of a passage connected to open space at the far end. Stay low and keep moving, Warren said behind me. The ceiling drops to about 2 feet in the middle section. When you see light ahead, you're close to the shed. I went in first. The passage was exactly as described and unlike anything I had experienced. The concrete pressed close on all sides. Within 15 feet, the ceiling came down hard, and I went to my stomach elbows, pulling me forward, the pack scraping the concrete above me, the cold of the floor coming through my jacket. The smell was earth and sealed stone and the faint mineral cold of deep ground. I could hear my own breathing amplified and strange. I could hear my father behind me, his movements careful and deliberate. The ceiling stayed low for what felt like a long time and was probably 12 feet. Then it rose. I got to my hands and knees, then to a crouch, and ahead of me, there was a different quality to the darkness, not black, but a deep gray, the gray of very early morning, seen through old boards. 12 feet later, I was climbing a short wooden ladder and pushing up through a hinged panel in the floor of a shed that smelled like diesel and rust and old metal, the smell of a space where machines had been kept for decades. The shed was small. Equipment I didn't recognize in the dark. A workbench along one wall. The boards of the walls were old and fitted imperfectly, and through the gaps came the pale gray light of a Wyoming morning that had been moving on without us. Warren came up behind me and was on his feet in a single motion. He moved to the shed door and cracked it an inch and looked through the gap for a moment without speaking. Cold air came through, the smell of frost and pine. "They're at the barn," he said quietly. I checked the prepaid phone. 6:52. We had been underground for nearly an hour. "How long to the tree line?" I said. 2 minutes if we move directly, he said. 4 if we stay in the shadow of the fence line. "Shadow of the fence," I said. He looked back at me and something in his expression settled in a way I recognized, the expression of a man who has just had his judgment confirmed by someone whose judgment he respects. "Shadow of the fence," he agreed. We went out the shed door and turned north. The fence line was old wooden posts connected by wire that had been standing long enough to have become part of the land rather than an addition to it. We moved along it in a low crouch, the frost-stiff grass muffling our steps, the morning light still thin and directionless in the way that early light is before the sun clears the mountains and commits to being day. From behind us, from the direction of the well, came the sound I had been waiting for, the wooden boards being moved. Then Bernard's voice carrying across the open field with the flat efficiency of a man doing a job. Down here, there's a ladder. Then Druce from further back unhurried. He went down. Warren kept moving. I stayed with him step for step. The pack was steady on my back. The tree line grew larger by increments. 60 yards, 40. Behind us the sound of metal on metal, someone on the rungs descending. 20 yards. Then the trees closed around us, and the darkness under the pine canopy absorbed us completely, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time since I had put my hands on that ladder an hour ago. Warren stopped. He leaned against a pine trunk and breathed in the deliberate way of a man managing the effort his body was reporting. In the dim light under the trees, his face was pale and drawn. The face of someone who has been underground for 7 years and is standing in open air for the first time and feeling both things simultaneously, the relief of it and the weight of all the time it has been absent. I unzipped the pack and found the prepaid phone and removed it from the zip bag. Powered it on. Vane's number, I said. He recited it from memory. I dialed. It rang twice. A woman's voice, immediate and alert, the voice of someone who had not been asleep. "Who is this?" she said. "My name is Caleb Marsh," I said. "I'm standing in the tree line north of the Harrow Bend property. I have my father with me. He says you'll know what that means." A brief silence. "Then is he all right?" I looked at my father standing against the pine tree with 7 years of underground living in the set of his shoulders and eyes that were watching me with something that had not been in them when I first turned the flashlight on him in that room below. Something that had been returning slowly in the course of the last hour. "He's standing," I said. "Is Druce on the property?" Vane said. "Yes, him and Bernard Caulfield. They found the well. They'll find the room in the next few minutes." "The drive," she said. "I have all 3. And the binders." A short pause. "Then I have been in contact with Agent Mercer at the Cheyenne field office since 6 this morning. They have been waiting for confirmation that you were clear of the structure. ETA to your location is 28 minutes. Stay in the trees. Do not move toward the road. If you reach the road before we do, you will be exposed. Keep this line open." She made a second call without disconnecting from me. I could hear the murmur of it, the clipped back and forth of coordination between people who have been planning for a specific moment and are now executing it. Warren came to stand beside me. We looked back through the trees at the farmstead. The barn, the house, the equipment shed, the land running south toward the mountains that were catching the first real light of morning and going from purple to a dark amber. He had not sold this land. Not for any price, not under any pressure, not through any of the 14 years of methodical encirclement and applied coercion that a man with unlimited resources and no particular concern for the human cost of his methods had brought to bear on him. He had simply continued to hold it. He had paid taxes on it faithfully and rebuilt the barn and eventually gone underground and built tunnels in the dark and waited with the patience of someone who has decided that the only acceptable outcome is the right one and who is prepared to take as long as that requires. From across the field, voices, elevated now, the sound of people who have discovered something they were not expecting. My father reached into his shirt pocket and checked that the recorder was running. It was. Every word Harlan Drew spoke in the next 28 minutes would go automatically to an encrypted account that Ingrid Vane could access, and from there to a federal agent in Cheyenne who had been building this case for 3 days and was now 28 minutes away. I stood in the cold under the pines and held the pack against my back and waited. The 28 minutes did not feel like 28 minutes. They felt like the kind of time that exists when you are standing still while something moves toward you, when the outcome depends on a sequence of events you have set in motion but can no longer control. And all that remains is to hold your position and not do anything that makes the situation worse. It is not comfortable time. It is the kind that makes itself known in your chest and in the stillness of your hands. Warren stood against the pine trunk with his arms folded and his eyes on the farmstead. He had the stillness of someone who had spent years practicing exactly this standing in a place where the available action was patience and applying himself to it completely. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a man who had made peace with waiting, because waiting had for a very long time been the only thing he could do, and who had learned to do it without spending himself against it. I stood beside him and listened. From the direction of the well, the voices had changed. The initial sharp quality of discovery had settled into something quieter and more deliberate, and I understood that quiet deliberateness in a powerful man is not an improvement over alarm. Loud is fear, quiet is planning. And a man like Harlan Druce, who had spent 40 years acquiring things through the patient application of money and will, and occasionally fire, was not a man who stayed frightened for long. He was a man who converted fear into calculation very quickly, and the calculation he was now running in that underground room involved two men who had just taken something he considered his and were somewhere on his property with it. My father said nothing. He was listening. The voices from the well resolved themselves gradually into distinguishable strands. Bernard first reporting something I couldn't make out clearly. Then Druce giving a direction precise and flat. Then movement, the sound of people climbing metal on metal ascending. They were coming up. 23 minutes remaining. I raised the phone to my ear. Vane was still on the line, the open connection a thin thread of sound between us. I told her they had come back up from the well. She said copy, that told me again not to move toward the road, and I could hear in her voice the controlled focus of someone executing a complex plan in real time, who needs the variables to stay where she put them. I lowered the phone but kept it in my hand. Beside me, Warren shifted slightly. He was watching the northeast corner of the barn, where a gap in the tree line gave us a partial sight line to the barnyard. Two figures had emerged from the area of the well and were moving toward the barn with purpose. Druce was easy to identify even at this distance. There was something in the way he moved that communicated a lifetime of being the person whose opinion about direction mattered most. He was not a large man, but he occupied space with the confidence of someone who had never seriously had to question his right to occupy it. Silver hair catching the morning light. A dark coat. The unhurried gait of a man who believed the situation was still despite everything manageable. Bernard walked beside him. I watched Bernard and tried to find in the set of his shoulders, in the angle of his stride, the man who had called every Sunday evening for 4 years, the man who had sat with me in my father's apartment, going through boxes, and who had been patient and present in all the ways that mattered. I couldn't find him. The man walking beside Harlan Druce across a Wyoming field was a different organization of the same physical material, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with anything he had represented to me. 4 years, I thought. 4 years of Sunday evenings and Stellan's birthdays, and sitting with me while I carried my father's absence. All of it performance, all of it directed somewhere else. It was a long time to perform something. Long enough that I found myself wondering involuntarily whether any of it had been real, whether some part of it had been genuine and had coexisted with the rest. Whether a person could do what Bernard had done and still have something authentic somewhere inside it, or whether the performance sustained long enough becomes the whole of a person. I set that aside. It was not the question that mattered right now. The question that mattered was the second vehicle. A heavier engine had arrived on the driveway earlier while we were still in the trees. I had counted at least 4 voices on the receiver before Warren turned it off. That meant 2 additional men beyond Druce and Bernard, and those men were somewhere on the property right now. I told Warren. He nodded. He had been tracking the same information. They'll cover the access points, he said quietly. The driveway, the county road junction. If Druce has resources on the way, they're here to ensure that nothing leaves the property before he's ready for it to leave, which meant the fire road that Vane was approaching from the north was a potential problem. I raised the phone again. There may be additional personnel on the county road junction, I said. Druce arrived with at least 2 others beyond Caulfield. We don't have visual on their current position. A pause from Vane. Then copy. Agent Mercer is aware. He has a 3rd vehicle holding on the highway approach. They'll move on the junction simultaneously with the property entry. Do not approach the road until you hear from me. I lowered the phone. 18 minutes. They were moving. From across the open ground between the farmstead and the tree line came the sound of Bernard's voice, projected outward rather than directed at anyone nearby, the deliberate carrying quality of a man who wants to be heard from a distance without appearing to shout. Caleb. I did not move. Warren did not move. Beside me in the pine dark, we stood and were still and let the name sit in the cold air without answering it. I know you can hear me. I just want to talk. The voice was Bernard's voice, the voice I recognized from 4 years of Sunday evenings and from the long drive across the plains the day before. But the warmth was gone from it, and what remained was the professional instrument of a man doing a job competent and modulated, designed to produce a specific effect. He was good at it. He had been good at it for 4 years, and I had not known. Whatever your father told you, Bernard said there are things he doesn't know, things that aren't what they look like. Come out, and we can sort this out. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Mr. Druce just wants to talk. There's a conversation that should have happened a long time ago. Warren said nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes were on Bernard's position at the edge of the barnyard. He was at Stellan's birthday, I said quietly. He brought a gift. He stayed for the whole afternoon. I know, Warren said. He called every week to check on him. I know, Warren said again. His voice was even. There was something underneath the evenness that I understood was being held there deliberately. I looked at Bernard across the cold open ground 140 yards away. I looked at the man who had shown up precisely when I needed someone to show up and had performed every gesture of care with sufficient accuracy that I had never once had reason to question it, and I thought about what that required. Not the information gathering, which was simply a skill. The care itself. The sustained, repeated daily performance of genuine feeling for a child he was there to monitor. That required a particular kind of cold intelligence, and I was not sure which of those things I found more difficult to reconcile with the memory of the afternoon he had sat on my floor, building blocks with a 6-year-old. When there was no response from the trees, Bernard waited another 30 seconds and then turned and walked back toward Druce. His shoulders had changed. The looseness was gone. He was moving with the purpose of a man who has finished one phase of an attempt and is reporting back for the next one. 15 minutes. The 4 men converged near the barn. I could see them from the tree line, their voices lowered now to the range where I could hear the presence of sound without distinguishing words. Planning. Druce was doing most of the talking. The others were listening. Then they separated. 2 went around the south side of the barn toward the equipment shed. I watched them go and understood that they would find the disturbed floor panel and the tunnel below it, and that when they did, they would understand how we had left and in what direction. Druce and Bernard came around the north side of the barn and stopped at the edge of the open ground between the structures and the tree line. They stood there for a moment. Druce looked at the trees. His silver hair caught the morning light. From this distance, I could not read his face, but I could read his stillness, the stillness of a man who is calculating, who is measuring the open ground against what he knows and doesn't know about what is waiting in the darkness beyond it. He won't come into the tree line, Warren said quietly, without knowing what he's walking into. Druce did not come into the tree line. He stood at the edge of the open ground for perhaps 2 minutes, and then he spoke. Not loudly, not projecting the way Bernard had. In a normal voice, the voice of a man in a meeting, clear and controlled, directed at the trees, as though the trees were a room he was addressing. Caleb Marsh, Druce said. The sound of my name in his voice was a strange thing. He knew me. He had known about me for years. He had placed a man in my life specifically because of me. And yet we had never met. And hearing him say my name with the familiarity of someone who had been monitoring me for years felt like a violation I did not have the exact word for. I think if we talk directly, Druce said, you'll find that the situation is more straightforward than your father has made it seem. There are arrangements that address everyone's interest here. Beside me, Warren's expression did not change. He's trying to get you to respond, Warren said very quietly. Any sound, any movement. He wants to know where we are. I said nothing. Druce waited. The morning was very cold and very still around his waiting. A bird called somewhere above us and went silent. The mountains behind the farmstead had gone from amber to a clear, pale gold as the sun cleared the peaks and committed to the day. Then Druce turned to Bernard and said something low and brief that I couldn't hear, and the two of them and the two men who had returned from the equipment shed, all four of them turned toward the tree line and began walking, not running, walking with the steady, deliberate pace of men who have decided and who have no reason to hurry because they believe the advantage is theirs. They were coming into the trees. 12 minutes. I turned to Warren. He was already looking at me. "We need to move north," he said. "I know," I said, but I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about Vane's instruction to stay in the trees and not approach the road. I was thinking about 12 minutes and four men moving toward us, and the way the tree line narrowed as it went north toward the fire road junction. I was thinking about the pack on my back with the 3 hard drives in it, the originals, the chain of custody evidence, everything Warren had spent 10 years building in the dark. And I was thinking about what my father had said in the underground room, that he had needed someone who would make decisions in the dark without a full picture and without being told how. That there was only one person he trusted with that. "We're not running," I said. Warren looked at me. "We're going back," I said. "Back toward them. Directly toward them." He was very still. I kept my voice low and even because the logic of it was sound, and I needed him to hear the logic rather than the fear underneath it, which was present and real and which I was setting aside. "They have 4 men and they're moving into the trees," I said. "If we go north, we're running a corridor, and they'll hear us moving, and they'll close the distance. We have 12 minutes. If we're moving when Vane arrives, we're exposed on the fire road with no cover. But if we hold position for 12 minutes against 4 men who know we're in these trees, we lose." I paused. "You need Druce to see you, with his own eyes. Not to hear about you later, not to see you in a photograph, not to read about it in a report. You need him to look at you standing in front of him and understand what it means, because that is what ends this decisively. And the recorder needs to be close enough to capture what he says when he understands it." Warren looked at me for a long moment. The trees around us were very quiet. The sound of the 4 men moving through underbrush was perhaps 40 yards behind us now. Irregular and not particularly careful, the sound of men who were confident rather than cautious. "If we go back toward them now," I said, "we control where the meeting happens. We choose the ground. We walk toward them instead of being found by them, and that is a different thing." Warren was quiet for another moment. Something was moving through his expression that I couldn't fully read, something working its way through several layers before it reached the surface. Then he said, "All right, stay behind my right shoulder," I said. "Half a step back." He looked at me with the gray eyes that my son had inherited, and he said, "All right, Caleb." And there was something in the way he said my name in that moment that I will carry for the rest of my life. Not the name itself, the weight he put in it, the weight of a man who has been waiting for a long time for a specific thing and has just watched it arrive. We turned around. We walked back through the trees toward the sound of 4 men moving through underbrush. I kept my pace steady and deliberate, not slow but not rush the pace of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. The pack was solid on my back. The phone was in my left hand with the line still open. The cold air moved through the pines above us, and the morning light came down in thin, broken columns through the canopy. The clearing appeared ahead of us, a natural break in the tree cover, perhaps 30 yards wide, where the canopy thinned and the sky came through in a wide, pale wash of morning light. We stepped into it from the south side at the same moment that the 4 men entered it from the east. Everyone stopped. The clearing was very quiet. Wind in the pine tops. A bird somewhere distant calling once and going silent. Harlan Druce was at the center of the group. Bernard to his right. 2 men at the periphery, younger, broader, the blank physical competence of men hired for situations rather than for their character. Druce looked at Warren. The change that moved through his face was the most complete thing I had ever seen happen to a human expression. It started at the jaw and moved upward, the color leaving first and then the control leaving after it. And for a moment, just a moment before the surface closed again, what was underneath was entirely visible. The disorientation of a man whose fundamental understanding of the situation has just been proven wrong in a way he cannot immediately account for. The specific fear of someone confronting something they had categorized as resolved and are now discovering was never resolved at all. He was afraid. For 3 full seconds, Harlan Druce was genuinely afraid in the open air of a Wyoming morning. And then he was not, or was not visibly, and the silver-haired controlled man reassembled himself over whatever was still moving underneath. He said a name. Not my father's name. The wrong name. Some name he had attached to Warren Marsh through whatever intelligence he had gathered over the years of this conflict. A name that revealed in its wrongness everything about the distance between what Druce thought he knew and what was actually true. Warren said nothing. I spoke first. My voice was the voice I used in the workshop when something needed to be stated clearly without aggression. Level, specific. The voice of someone who has worked with materials long enough to understand that clarity is more effective than force. My name is Caleb Marsh, I said. I am the legal owner of this property. You are trespassing. I want you to understand the current situation before you take any further action. Druce looked at me. His eyes moved from my face to the pack on my back and stayed there for a moment with an expression that was the controlled version of what his face had done when he first saw Warren. The calculation running visibly behind it. The drives, he said. Among other things, I said. You've had time to see what was on the shelf. He looked at Warren again. Something in the way he looked had changed from the first moment the shock absorbed and replaced by the attention of a man who was reassessing a situation from new coordinates. You've been here the entire time, he said. Not quite a question. My father, yes. The recordings, everything on those drives. You were here for all of it. For the last 10 years, Warren said. A silence settled over the clearing. The 2 hired men at the periphery had not moved. Bernard had not moved. I watched him in my peripheral vision and found that I could not look at him directly right now, and that this was a decision I would need to hold until later. Druce was calculating. I could see it, the rapid practice assessment of a man who had built a career on finding the remaining viable move in complicated situations. He looked at the pack. He looked at Warren. He looked at the tree line behind us, and then at the tree line behind him. Then he found what he thought was the angle. The copies, he said. You sent copies to Cheyenne. 3 days ago, Warren said. Then the originals are still in play. If something were to happen to those drives, the copies become the sole record. There are provenance questions, authentication arguments. With the right representation, copies without originals can be challenged in ways that create sufficient uncertainty. He let that land. There is a structure here, he said, where everyone leaves this property with something. The land transfers at a number that recognizes its true value. The materials in that pack are returned as a condition of the arrangement. Your father's situation is complicated, but there are ways to address complications if the underlying issue is resolved. A man who has been living off the grid for 7 years has certain legal exposures that the right relationships can make manageable. Stop, I said. He looked at me. I let a moment pass. The wind moved through the pines above the clearing. The morning light was full now, the sun clear of the mountains, the sky a hard, cold blue. I want you to understand something, I said. Every word you have spoken on this property since you arrived yesterday has been recorded. Every word you have spoken in the last 9 minutes has been recorded. The device recording your voice right now uploads automatically and continuously to a remote server that is not on this property, that is not accessible to you, and that you cannot reach regardless of what happens in the next 5 minutes. I paused. You just described a plan to destroy evidence and offered a financial arrangement in exchange for the suppression of a federal case. That statement already exists somewhere you cannot get to. You cannot reach it. You cannot delete it. You cannot buy it. The clearing was very still. Druce stood with the morning light on his silver hair and his 2 hired men at the edge of the trees and Bernard to his right, and he looked at me with the expression of a man whose calculation has reached its terminus. The place where there are no remaining angles, no residual viable moves. The stillness of a man who has spent 40 years finding ways through situations and has arrived at the first situation he cannot find his way through. I watched him arrive at it. I watched the moment it landed fully. He looked at Bernard. Bernard was looking at me. I made myself look back at him directly, which I had been avoiding and was now doing because it seemed like the honest thing to look at him fully rather than to refuse the difficulty of it. His face was not what I had expected. It was not defiant. It was not the blank professional face of someone executing a job without feeling. It was something more complicated than either of those things, and I did not have a clean word for it. It was the face of a man who has been performing something for a very long time, Sunday after Sunday, birthday after birthday, performing care with sufficient accuracy that the person receiving it never questioned it, and who is now standing in the specific moment where he must look at that person and acknowledge in his own internal accounting what the performance cost both of them. Not guilt exactly, not remorse exactly. Something that lived in the territory between those two things and was its own particular weight. He looked at me for a moment, then he looked away. I held that. I let it exist without trying to resolve it into something simpler because it was not simple and because the simpler version of it would be less true. The sound reached us a moment after I had stopped expecting it. Tires on the fire road to the north moving fast. Not one vehicle. Two. The sound of engines with authority behind them moving toward a destination rather than through it. My father's eyes went to the northern edge of the clearing. A third vehicle coming from the east on a different approach, the sound of it cutting through the trees on the other side of the property. Then Ingrid Vane stepped into the clearing from the north. She was a spare woman in her late 50s, short gray hair, the Teton County Sheriff's uniform, with a jacket over it against the cold. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing difficult work in isolated places for a long time, and had learned that deliberateness was more effective than speed in most situations that mattered. Her hand was on her belt, but not on her weapon. Her face was set in the expression of a woman who had spent years waiting for a specific morning and had arrived at it and was going to conduct herself exactly as she had intended. Behind her, two men in federal jackets moved through the tree line and positioned themselves on the north side of the clearing. A third agent came around the south edge so that there was no direction in the clearing without law enforcement in it. The geometry of it was exact. It had been planned for a long time, Harlan Druce Vane said. Her voice was even and formal and carried everything that needed to be carried in it without excess. The weight of years of careful work of a body incorrectly buried of a man who had lived underground for 7 years to make this morning possible, and of a case that was complete and had been given to the right people and was now being executed in a Wyoming clearing on a cold November morning with the mountains going gold in the distance. "I am placing you under arrest," she said, on federal charges, including conspiracy, bribery of public officials, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. The two hired men at the edge of the trees did not resist. The federal agents moved to them without discussion, and the clearing resolved itself quickly into the efficient bureaucracy of law enforcement, doing something it has prepared for and is now executing correctly. Vane looked at Bernard. Bernard stood very still. He was not looking at Druce. He was not looking at Vane. He was looking at a point in the middle distance that was not any specific thing, the look of a man who has arrived at the end of something and is taking a moment with it before what comes next. Vane's agent moved to him. Bernard did not resist. He brought his hands together behind his back with the quiet compliance of a man who has been in this moment in his imagination for some time, and who had decided somewhere in the years of performing something for someone who trusted him, that when it came to this, he would at least go without making it worse. He was cuffed and turned, and as he turned, he looked at me. I let myself look back. I held it fully without looking away because it seemed like the honest thing to look at him fully rather than to refuse the difficulty of it. I looked at the man who had called on Sunday evenings, who had helped me carry boxes, who had asked about Stellan with the right frequency, in the right tone, and sufficient warmth that I had never had any reason to question any of it. There was nothing to say between us. There was no version of anything I could say that would be useful or that would go anywhere productive. What had happened was what it was, and both of us understood it completely, and understanding it completely was the only acknowledgement available. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked away because that was the only thing I had left to give him, and I chose to give it. Not forgiveness, not the absence of anger, just the simple act of releasing him from my attention. He was led out of the clearing. Drew said nothing as they put the cuffs on him. He was looking at Warren. His jaw was set, and his face was entirely controlled, and there was nothing readable in it now. No fear, no calculation. Nothing that would give you information about the interior state of a man who had spent 14 years and considerable resources and various forms of destruction on a piece of land he now understood he had never been going to get. Warren looked back at him. My father's face in that moment was the face I remembered from childhood when something was finished. Not triumphant, not relieved. The face of a man who has done a specific thing for a long time and has seen it completed correctly, and for whom the completion is simply the confirmation that the doing was worth it. Druce looked away first. Then it was over in the way that large things end not all at once, but by stages, each stage more administrative than the one before it. Vane walked me through the chain of custody procedure for the drives, each one removed from the pack and logged and photographed and placed in a numbered evidence bag and signed for. I signed forms I barely read because Vane explained each one clearly, and I trusted the clarity. Agent Mercer, a quiet man in his 40s, with a face that processed information without displaying much of it, sat with Warren at the farmhouse kitchen table for nearly 90 minutes while I waited on the porch. The Teton County sky went from pale gray to a clear, hard blue as the morning advanced. The mountains caught the full light and went through their sequence of colors, purple to brown, to the particular shade of amber that had no name I knew. The frost burned off the grass as the temperature climbed. The pine trees along the property line moved in a wind that smelled like altitude and distance, and something clean. 87 acres of it in every direction. I sat on the porch steps and let the exhaustion arrive. It had been waiting for permission, and now that I gave it, it came all at once, the way exhaustion does when you stop refusing it. Heavy and complete. The weight of having done something that needed to be done and that is now done, and your body understanding that it can stop preparing for what comes next. Vane came and sat beside me on the steps after a while. She was a woman who understood silence the way my father did, not as an absence to be filled, but as a condition with its own content. We sat in it for a few minutes before either of us spoke. He went underground 7 years ago, she said. I have been coordinating with him for the last 2 of those years. The years before that, he was alone. She was looking out at the land. I brought him supplies when the conditions allowed, she said. Every few months. He had everything he needed for extended periods, but she paused. Adequate food and water is not the same as adequate light, and there is no substitute for another person. She was quiet for a moment. He is the most patient man I have encountered in 30 years of this work. He always was, I said. We sat with that. The case, I said eventually. What happens now? She tilted her head slightly. Druce has already called his attorneys. That started within 60 seconds of the cuffs going on. She paused. But Agent Mercer has had 3 days with the copies, and he is a thorough man. He now has the originals with unbroken chain of custody documented and witnessed. He has the cloud recordings from this morning, which are time-stamped and complete. And he has the statement Druce made in the clearing about authentication gaps and the arrangement he proposed. She looked at me sideways. That particular statement is going to be very useful in a number of ways. I thought of Druce in the clearing, still calculating, still looking for the angle, even as the angles closed. 40 years of finding ways through. The reflex that couldn't be turned off, even when turning it off, was the only thing that might have helped him. And Bernard, I said. Vane was quiet for a moment. Caulfield has been working for Druce for at least 11 years, she said. We have documentation from the recordings going back 6. She paused. He will cooperate. He has nowhere else to go from here. His cooperation will cover things that are not on those drives. He was in my life for 4 years, I said. Not to her specifically, just putting it somewhere outside of me where it could exist in the open air. I know, she said. He knew my son. I know, she said again. And there was nothing more to say than that, and she understood it and said nothing more. Warren came out of the house an hour later. He moved carefully down the porch steps, the careful movement of a man whose body had been asked for a great deal over a long period and was still working through the accounting of it. Agent Mercer followed him to the door and then stopped there and let him continue alone. Warren stepped off the bottom porch step onto the gravel of the driveway and stopped. He stood with his face turned up toward the sky. He was not doing anything. He was not speaking, not moving, not looking at any specific thing. He was standing in outdoor air for the first time in what his body understood to be a very long interval. And he was standing there with his face up and his eyes open and breathing it, the cold November air of a Wyoming morning, with the mountains on one side and the pine trees on the other, and 87 acres of dried autumn grass going golden around him. I watched him do this. After a while, he looked at me. I stood up from the steps. We stood on the porch of a house he had owned for 22 years and protected for 14 by every means available to him. We stood in the morning light and we looked at each other. There were many things to say, years of them. The grief I had carried for 7 months that had to be unlearned, grief for a person who was standing in front of me, and the complexity of unlearning it, while also understanding why it had been necessary, and the anger underneath it that had a legitimate claim. The questions I hadn't asked, the answers he hadn't given, all of it was real and all of it was waiting. But there was also this. I was standing on a porch in Wyoming and my father was alive. The sky above us was extraordinary. The land around us was ours. Some things can wait for the right words. The coffee maker in the kitchen, I said. Does it work? He looked at me. Something moved through his expression and arrived at a place I recognized, the small sideways thing at the corner of his mouth that I had grown up reading as the highest register of what he felt, the expression that meant he had been caught off guard in a way he found he didn't mind. I believe so, he said. I haven't tested it in some years. Let's find out, I said. We went inside. The coffee maker worked. It was an old drip machine, the kind that takes its time and produces something reliably adequate. We stood in the kitchen while it worked, and the smell of it filled the old house, and we talked. We talked for a long time, about things I had wondered about for years and accepted as unanswerable, about the 14 years before the recordings, when the pressure from Druce had been personal and direct, and Warren had absorbed it alone because he hadn't known yet what he was going to do about it, about the decision to fake his death and how long he had deliberated over it. I thought about calling you, he said at one point. His hands were around his coffee mug. 100 times. Why didn't you? Because Caulfield had been in place for 3 years by the time I went underground. He paused. If I called you, you would have changed. Something in how you carried yourself. He was good at reading changes. He was placed there specifically to read changes. I understood. The calculation that had kept him silent for 7 years was not the calculation of a man who didn't want to call. It was the calculation of a man who understood that calling would have put me in danger and had chosen the harder thing in order to keep me out of it. The same calculation he had been making for 22 years in various forms. Stellan has your eyes, I said. Something moved across my father's face that had no precedent in my memory of him. His face, which had always been the face of a man who kept things inside and let them out in small, carefully controlled amounts, opened in a way it had never opened in my presence. I know, he said. His voice was careful around it. Ingrid showed me photographs. He paused. He looks like his father. He's stubborn, I said. Like his grandfather. My father smiled. A real one, reaching the places around his eyes, filling in the lines of a face that had spent too long without occasion for it. We sat with that for a while. The legal process that followed the events of that morning extended over many months. Harlan Druce was indicted on 11 federal counts, including bribery of public officials, wire fraud conspiracy, and 3 counts related to the intentional harassment and intimidation of a landowner whose identity was now a matter of considerable public interest. 2 Teton County commissioners were indicted on related charges. A member of the Wyoming State Lands Board resigned and entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors within 2 weeks of the arrest. Bernard Caulfield pleaded guilty to 3 counts, including conspiracy and fraud. His cooperation with federal investigators was described in coverage of the subsequent proceedings as substantial. He received a reduced sentence. I did not follow the details closely. I made a decision in the weeks after that November morning that I would give Bernard exactly as much of my attention as the legal requirements demanded, and no more, and I kept that decision. Warren spent 10 weeks in a medical facility in Cheyenne, the result of 7 years of insufficient light, inadequate nutrition at intervals, and the long-term attrition of profound isolation. He recovered. Not quickly and not without difficulty, but he recovered. He put on weight. He walked longer distances each week. He called me every evening at 7, which was when I finished work, and we talked for however long we talked. Those conversations were different from any we had ever had. They were honest in a way that our conversations had never quite managed to be, not because either of us had been dishonest before, but because the silences that had always been part of how Warren Marsh communicated were no longer there. He had decided in the underground years to be done with closed chapters. It cost him something to be done with them. Some evenings I could hear it costing him, but he did not retreat from it. The mineral rights question was resolved over the course of several months of legal and geological consultation. The deposit was significant, the geologist confirmed, and the access situation was exactly as Warren had described. I was approached by 3 extraction companies within the first month after the indictments became public. I declined to meet with the first 2. The third was a mid-sized operation out of Missoula with an environmental compliance record that Ingrid Vane helped me assess, and the assessment was sound. The negotiations took 5 months and required me to read documents I was not trained to read and to understand things I had not known I would need to understand. Warren helped sitting at the kitchen table in the farmhouse with his reading glasses and his coffee going through the technical sections with the patience he brought to any problem that had an answer if you were willing to look for it long enough. Vane helped. The attorney I retained was thorough and unhurried and earned what I paid her. The arrangement we reached was not the arrangement that Harlan Druce would have made with this land. It contained provisions for environmental assessment and remediation at each stage. It returned a percentage of extraction revenue to Teton County infrastructure. It included conditions for land reclamation after the extraction phase concluded binding conditions with financial penalties for non-compliance, not suggestions, but requirements. It was not simple, and it was not quick, and it was at the end of it something I could stand behind. I was at the farmhouse on the January morning when the first survey team arrived. Men with equipment moving across the 87 acres in the thin winter light, their breath visible in the cold. I stood on the porch and watched them and felt the complicated feeling that complicated things produce. Not pride exactly, not peace. Something in the territory between them that didn't have a clean name and didn't need one. Warren stood beside me. He had been staying in the farmhouse since his discharge from the Cheyenne facility. Living in it, actually living in it, for the first time in the 22 years he had owned it. He had painted the porch. He had repaired the sagging corner with the systematic attention of a man who has been waiting a long time to take care of things and is now taking care of them one at a time. He had cleared the overgrowth from the area around the old equipment shed and fixed the hinges on the barn doors that had been off true for years. He had rehung the gate at the end of the driveway. He had rebuilt the fence line along the north edge of the property where the old posts had finally given up. He had not touched the well. I asked him about that once in early December when I was visiting and we were walking the property line in the early morning the way we had started doing when the weather allowed. "Why leave it?" I said. He looked at the well from a distance for a moment. The stone ring, the replaced boards sitting slightly crooked from where I had moved them in October. The overgrowth already beginning to reclaim the stones. I'm not entirely sure, he said. I thought I understood. Some things that carry you through difficult times have earned the right to remain. Not as monuments, nothing that formal, just as facts that deserve to continue existing. This is where it happened. This is the place the distance was crossed. Stellan met his grandfather in February. It was a Saturday, cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming winter day where the sky is an impossible blue and the light has no warmth in it, but an enormous clarity that makes everything look precise and close. I drove up from Columbus with Stellan in the back seat, asking questions about Wyoming that I answered until I ran out of answers, and he started looking out the window at the mountains instead, which was a more honest response anyway. He was 6 years old. He had Warren's eyes. He had the considered, unhurried way of taking in new situations that I had watched develop in him over his whole short life, the willingness to observe carefully before deciding what he thought. Warren was on the porch when we pulled in. Stellan got out of the car and stood in the gravel and looked at his grandfather. Warren came down the porch steps and crouched in front of him, which I knew still cost him something in his knees, and looked back. They looked at each other for a moment with equal seriousness. "Dad said you were gone," Stellan said. "I was," Warren said. "And now you're not," Stellan said. "That's right," Warren said. Stellan thought about this in the careful way he thought about things. 10 seconds, perhaps 15. Then he said okay and walked past his grandfather into the house to investigate the kitchen, which was how he approached any new space, by opening every drawer and cabinet until he understood what was in them. Warren stayed crouched in front of the empty space Stellan had just occupied. He stayed there for a moment after the boy passed, with his hands on his knees and his head slightly bowed. Then he straightened and turned and looked at me. His face was entirely open. No closed rooms, nothing withheld. The face of a man who has spent a lifetime keeping things inside and has arrived at a moment where there is nothing left that needs to be kept, and who finds the openness of it almost more than he can manage, but is managing it anyway. I stepped forward and put my hand on his shoulder. He put his hand over mine. We stood in the driveway of the farmhouse on 87 acres of Wyoming land in the February cold, and the winter light came flat and clear across the fields. And inside the house, Stellan was opening and closing kitchen cabinets with the methodical focus of a boy who needs to understand what is in every drawer. My father had never sold this land. Not for any price, not under any pressure, not under any circumstances. Never. And the instruction in the will, those words he had written and had Silas Holt read aloud in a quiet office above a hardware store in a small Wyoming town, had not been a warning. It had been an explanation. He had written it knowing I would wonder why. He had written it so that when I finally understood the whole of it, I would understand this too, that there are things worth protecting at extraordinary cost, and that the cost itself is part of the protection, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to give something away. He had refused. For 22 years, in every variation of pressure that a resourceful and ruthless man could bring to bear on him, Warren Marsh had held on. He had paid taxes on Wyoming land from a Columbus apartment and kept his silence, and rebuilt a burned barn, and eventually gone underground and dug tunnels in the dark, and waited with the patience of a man who builds things to last and understands that some work takes longer than a single season. The land was ours. The truth was out. The man who had spent 14 years trying to take both was answering for it in a federal courtroom in Cheyenne. And my father was on the porch in Wyoming alive, watching his grandson investigate the kitchen with the focused intensity he brought to everything he decided was worth understanding. The well behind the barn still had its boards across the top. The vines had been growing back over the stone since October. By spring, it would be difficult to find if you didn't know to look for it. Just another feature of an old property easily missed, easily passed by, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't stood at the edge of it in the dark and understood what was below. But I knew it was there. Some mornings when I visited, I walked out to the backfield alone in the early light and stood at the edge of it for a while. Not to go down, just to stand there. Just to remember what it felt like to reach for the first rung in the dark, trusting something that had no name yet, and to find at the bottom of it the thing I had spent 7 months learning to live without. The table saw in my Columbus workshop still needed its vibration problem solved when I got home. I fixed it the weekend after I returned, found the source in the first 20 minutes once I had the patience to listen to it correctly. A slight warp in the arbor flange, nothing catastrophic, just something that had been telling me something for 3 weeks, and that I hadn't been still enough to hear. My father had taught me that. A tool that vibrates wrong is a tool that's telling you something. He had been trying to tell me something for 22 years, in the silences at the kitchen table, in the way he went still when certain questions came too close, in the weight of everything he chose not to say. I had learned to read those silences as something private, something earned, something that belonged to him alone. I understood now that they had always been for me, that everything he had done, the land and the taxes and the tunnels and the 7 years underground, had been a form of the same language he had always spoken, the language of preparation, of building something before you need it, of handing someone the right tool before they know they need it. He had handed me the right tool. I had known how to use it.